Buenas tardes. Empezamos ya el tramo final, antes de la parte lúdica, y como os decía Fernando, pues por deferencia hacia Jeff, le voy a presentar en inglés. I'm really glad to be here introducing my old friend Jeff Nelson here in Spain, a dream made reality and a privilege we all owe to Jeff. Generous availability and to CEU-CEFAS. I met Jeff Nelson a long time ago. It's not necessary to specify the years, but many years ago when he was working for the ISI, the Intercollegiate Studies Institute. His work there was really impressive, and I think that the American conservative movement would be very different and less interesting without the ISI imprint. Jeff has studied at the University of Detroit, at Yale University Divinity School, and he earned a PhD in American history from the University of Edinburgh in Scotland. His dissertation was on for me, a much beloved topic, Edmund Burke and America. But Jeff has been the contrary of that cliché, that image of the wise man that lives apart from the world. During his undergraduate years in Detroit, Jeff discovered ISI, founded a chapter, brought in speakers, attended seminars in Mecosta. He then became one of Russell Kirk's literary assistants after graduating. It was also very important for his life because he also met and eventually married Cecilia, who is with us also, Dr. Kirk's second daughter. Jeff was the founding editor and publisher of ISI Books, which they publish really interesting books, some also from European intellectuals. He was also editor of the Intercollegiate Review and editor to the University Bookman, where he currently serves as its publisher and editor at large. He has served as president of the Thomas More College of Liberal Arts in New Hampshire. He is founder and treasurer of the Edmund Burke Society of America and publisher of the Society's journal Studies in Burke and His Time. Jeff has been recognized by the American Enterprise Institute as a leader in educational reform and college guidance for students in search of a genuine liberal arts education, and is a member of its Conservative Education Reform Network. Jeff is also the editor of several books, including 2 books by Russell Kirk, Redeeming the Time and the Political Principles of Robert Taft. He co-edited American Conservative, an encyclopedia, a really impressive book, and edited books by mentors of his, such as Perfect Sewing, Reflections of a Bookman by Henry Regnery. Perhaps you know the publishing company, Regnery Books, and Remember Past by the influential historian John Lukács. Jeff is also co-founder of the Russell Kirk Center for Cultural Renewal with Annette Kirk, and is currently its executive director and CEO. As you can see, with all this huge activity, it is difficult to downplay the importance of Jeff, and especially of the Kirk Center and of Russell Kirk. If one pays attention to the goal of the Kirk Center, which is strengthen the permanent things, especially as they relate to America's tradition of order, justice, and freedom, you can imagine how important it is. This Kirk Center is based at Russell Kirk's ancestral home of Mecosta, Michigan. Some people from CEFAS have been there. Some people will be there this summer, mm-hmm. And I hope to visit them soon. The Kirk Center currently hosts seminars, research, and fellowship opportunities in what is unique residential library and conference centers. Let me say some few words about Russell Kirk, because I think that is the figure around we all are thinking and all this, and it's at the back of all these initiatives. I discovered Russell Kirk when I read an old Spanish translation quite some years ago, and was captivated by his clear thinking, his profound knowledge of history, politics, literature, and I would say of the human being. Then I remember how I devoured the conservative mind, and that changed the way I think, for better. I see now the world different, and Kirk's works have given me a solid foundation for all these reflections and thoughts about the world. We live in a world, in a time when there are plenty of people that arrive to social media with the conservative label, and they consider themselves as the messengers to save the world. Of course, they come and go as their weak ideas vanish, replaced by the next intellectual fashion, which will last little time to. With Russell Kirk, it's exactly the opposite. Precisely because his thought is built upon permanent things. Russell Kirk is someone not interested in being the last hit, but in building solid ideas rooted in reality. I think that's the key of its importance, and why he keeps being so influential and so significant. So, as you can understand, I'm eager to hear what Jeff is going to tell us, and ready to learn from him. So, Jeff,
thank you.
You have the floor.
Can you hear? Well, that introduction was a dream come true, and it's a dream to be here with you, Jorge, after all these years, although we did see each other in Washington last year and reconnected, which is wonderful. We're both old bookmen. Well, we were young bookmen when we met. Yeah. Now we're grandfathers, so time keeps on going, but we're still the same in many ways. So it's wonderful to be here with you and back into Spain, which is such a great country. I wish I could speak your great, beautiful language. I wish I could pray in your beautiful language. That would be even better. But it is, so you're stuck with my English. This is Lucia Vallejo's fault. So you can blame her, except she conveniently left for a wedding, so she's not here to be blamed. But later you can tell her I said so. Well, yes, I will talk to you about Russell Kirk. I'm guessing that Jorge notwithstanding, that many of you know little or not so much about Russell Kirk. Let me just say in the beginning that Russell Kirk is considered to be the father of intellectual conservatism in America. There are two conservative movements in America, at least two, maybe a couple more, but one, the earliest main movement is an intellectual movement, a movement of ideas that was countering the liberal progressive hegemony, as it said, of the last century, at a very high level. And about a decade later, once those ideas began to gain traction, were heard and gain people to believe, then the political conservative movement took over, and people began to run political parties, political offices. Eventually, in the 1960s. A presidential candidate first to declare himself a conservative presidential candidate Barry Goldwater, and 16 years later Ronald Reagan, and just off to the races. So I don't want to go down the political, but other to say that there are these two rivers that occasionally come together in a big pool, and that American conservatism, even at the political level, has always been very uniquely a very energetic movement of ideas, very concerned about ideas, very concerned that young conservatives are formed in ideas, that they know first principles of conservatism. Many, many institutions, you mentioned one, the Intercollegiate Studies Institute, very famous for doing that, concerned with college students understanding conservatism, because it's not taught in the colleges. So we have to educate outside the universities in order to teach the next generation fundamental Christian conservative principles. So Russell Kirk is considered the father of that movement because in 1953 he wrote a book called The Conservative Mind that challenged more than a half century, almost a century of belief amongst liberal elites that America had only one intellectual tradition, and that was the liberal tradition, of course. There was no such thing in America as a respectable conservative intellectual tradition. The conservative mind came along and changed that by showing, by demonstrating through an intellectual genealogy, a family tree, if you will, of conservative thinkers from the very origins of even colonial British America through the American founding and up through the 19th and 20th century. Not just politicians, many poets, playwrights, novelists, literary critics, a whole mix of important thinkers that influenced the direction and in many ways informed the very best set of American principles over time. So, and this was a major development in American intellectual life that then became obviously a big political movement. So that's just a way of giving you a context of Russell Kirk's significance at the outset. We'll talk a little bit more about his ideas now. I'm going to do that by drawing not just on Russell Kirk, although mainly on Russell Kirk, but also on another thinker. Actually, it's a thinker Lucia is studying for her PhD thesis, a thinker by the name of Robert Nisbet. These are both considered early, important, sort of traditionalist-oriented conservative thinkers. So I'm just kind of go back and forth a little bit with Nisbet and Kirk and Nisbet. So you'll hear me doing that a little bit. Kirk was a historian. He was also a literary figure. He wrote very famous ghost stories, Gothic tales. In some ways, he's known more in the era of the uncanny or Gothic fiction, where he's considered a founder, a revivalist in that area, as well, or as much or more as a political thinker. So he combines ideas and imagination very directly in his thought, and his political thought. Robert Nisbet, rather, was a sociologist, and he spent most of his life in the academy and the university. Russell Kirk left the university very young. He was not happy about the direction of American higher education, and so started out on his own and led an independent life of American letters his whole life, which is very unusual to be able to do that even today. Nisbet and Kirk were friends. They corresponded, and their books influenced the foundations of a conservative thought. They were key. People often talk about this period as the conservative renaissance in America, the American conservative renaissance. So you hear them as being talked of as key figures, which sought to the restoration of traditional beliefs, practices, institutions, as a response to the excesses of modernity and liberalism. What I want to do is draw upon these figures in a way is just not only just looking back, as we'll discuss. That's Kirk looked back, but he didn't only look back. He also he looked back in order to understand how best to move forward. So Lucia asked me to think a little bit about what is it about Kirk's and Nisbet's politics then that has contemporary influence today and possibilities for renewal. First, an overview. American conservative politics for Kirk and Nisbet, at its core, sought to preserve and nurture timeless values and institutions that have proven essential to human flourishing. Americans love this phrase. American conservatives love this phrase now, flourishing, human flourishing. How do we create, sort of institutions, policies, practices that lead to human flourishing. It's less controversial, I suppose, than leading directly with a Christian political program. Instead, it's a little bit of a camouflage, but that's kind of what they mean. In a rapidly changing world, of course, it's necessary to reevaluate and to adapt conservative principles to effectively address these contemporary challenges. I think the fusion of Kirk's focus on tradition, order, and the moral imagination, which we'll talk about this phrase, which comes from Burke, the moral imagination, with Robert Nisbet's emphasis on community and social institutions and the importance of decentralization, the opposite of centralized, breaking down to a lower level, societal institutions. So decentralization can provide the basis for a new conservative politics that addresses the needs of the present era. Both Kirk and Nisbet drew upon Edmund Burke, the great English political thinker, who is considered in the Anglo-conservative world, Britain and America, as the philosophical, father, the ultimate political thinker, source of conservative thought. So he is sort of the go-to manual, if you will. Not that there's exactly that, but his book, The Reflections on the Revolution in France, which was the first book to really detect that something new and radical was happening with the idea of the French Revolution. It's very different from the American Revolution, which is more conservative, conservating British traditions and rights, which they thought were violated by the king. So Edmund Burke is very important. And paradoxically, he has a phrase that both Kirk and Nisbet seized on. And he said, in the Reflections, Burke has this phrase, change is the means of our conservation. Change is the means of our conservation. That means that in order to really preserve and conserve the goods of society, the goods of the West, the goods of your nation, change has to be part of that conservation and preservation. It's preserving, it's a very dynamic idea that Burke had and that Kirk really puts into practice. Many people think of conservatism as a mere defense of the status quo, right? Just stuck in the past, obsessed with the past, nothing can be good and important. It's not American conservatives, that's not been that way. They've been more focused on how to unpack this idea that's so important, that change and preservation are happening at the same time. And to be conservative, to conserve, you have to be engaged in change, which means you have to be a reformer. You have to learn how to reform, not throw the baby out with the bathwater or set institutions on fire because you don't like them. But you're constantly working to preserve what is good while changing, having a disposition to change. So that dynamic is going on, and it plays out in public policy too. So they were reforming conservatives, is a way to think of it. Their thought combined this ability to see where and when reform was necessary while still having an overriding disposition to preserve. So you have to see when it's right to reform, when an institution needs reforming, but you begin with a disposition to preserve. So that's an important starting point for conservatives. In some quarters, people refer to this as preservative reform. Preservative reform. So the qualifying a reform is preserving. It seems straightforward, but it's hard for politicians, statesmen, or policy people to act in that way. The temptation is just to change. See a bad thing, eliminate it, start over. Reformers and statesmen in this tradition must at once hold what Burke called the bank and capital of the ages. Sort of what the ages what past is stored up in the bank, the capital for us. Draw upon that while you're reforming and coming up with new public policy measures or new institutions, et cetera, in our time. There's a very current and influential thinker by the name of Yuval Levin. I don't know if you've heard some of you are interested in public policy. He's at the American Enterprise Institute. And he speaks quite a lot about this, Yuval Levin. And I'll give you a quote because it kind of explains it, I think, better than I can. He says, quote, "The fundamental insight of Burke's and Kirk's positive case for reform is that a statesman, or a party leader, ought to begin from gratitude for what works in his society, gratitude, rather than from outrage at what does not work. He must begin from a sense of what he has and what is worth preserving, and from there build toward what he wants and what is worth achieving. But without question, change is not only inevitable, but desirable. And without developing an effective means of change, a nation might even risk the loss of that part of the Constitution which it wished the most religiously to preserve. This difficult task of preservative improvement is, to Kirk's mind, to Edmund Burke's mind, the most demanding and most important challenge of political life." Now, moving from the change as the means of our conservation point to the preservative reform, I'll move into another area of Kirk's thought, which is really kind of promoting a conservatism that transcends political partisanship. Right? These are ideas, they're universal, they're true. It really is going below a political partisanship. Kirk's conservatism transcended mere ideology, as he framed it in his famous book, The Conservative Mind. Kirk insisted that true conservatism is not a rigid ideology, and I'll talk about this word ideology. It's very important to Kirk and to Burke, both. He's opposed at every level to a rigid form of ideology, but rather, as I just mentioned, is a disposition that respects the complexity and the variety of human institutions, culture, and history. It's a disposition to renew institutions and traditions. As such, conservatism is not a program so much. It's not a program or a platform. It's a patrimony. Right? Patrimony. It's who we are. It's what we inherit. That's what we deal with. An inheritance of all that we have learned over the ages about people, about the city, about our commonwealth. It's a disposition of, well, you said this, I think more or less, of openness to reality as it is, as the world as it is, not as we wish it would be. This is pre-political, and much of the intellectual conservative movement is pre-political, but it is the essential framework of genuine conservatism. You may have the phrase that we have say a lot now in America, that politics is downstream from culture. And politics is downstream, and culture washes over it, influences your politics. This is what I'm getting at. For Kirk, an ideology, and Burke, an ideology is it's the opposite of what I just said. It's a closed system, a closed way of thinking. Right? An ideology. It's a claim to have found the final answers to the search for truth. It's utopian. Utopian. But for the conservatives, there are no final answers. We know through history that circumstances change and that knowing and understanding is never ending. On the contrary, conservatives like Kirk argue that a transcendent order exists and is the basis of all reality, but that while truth and reality exist, we cannot know it perfectly. Kirk advocated for a conservatism that was rooted in prudence, humility, and a respect for the past, and was critical of the dogmatic ideologies that sought to impose abstract theories on society. Of course, this was Burke's big argument against the French Revolution earlier. Instead of an ideology, conservatives cultivate this moral imagination. Again, this phrase comes from Burke as well. Modern politics is essentially a contest for Kirk between the idyllic imagination of Rousseau, which fostered utopian and egalitarian schemes of social salvation, and the moral imagination of Burke. For any society, the primary challenge is to grasp by imagination and symbol the enduring truths and transmit them to a new generation, afresh, not only by politics, but especially maybe through literature, poetry, drama, music, film, This is a big area for decades of conservative thought, not with great success, but they try very hard to engage this part of the culture through the imagination, the imaginary life, the life of the imagination, which, as Napoleon once said, rules the world. Imagination. You got one thing right. Recovering such a nuanced, and this is a very nuanced approach to conservatism, is one of our great challenges today. Fostering a more thoughtful and reflective conservatism that is not only focused on political power or partisan battles. Well, for the foundations of Kirk and Robert Nisbet's conservative thought is more cautious. It's a more cautious approach to modern progress and technocratic culture, and would, I think, as getting applied today, foster a greater commitment to the preservation of tradition and the wisdom of the past. This would build upon Kirk's idea that tradition is living. This is very important. It's a living tradition. It provides the wisdom and accumulated experience of previous generations. And so a renewed conservative politics, if we were to apply this to politics, would emphasize the importance of preserving cultural, moral, and societal traditions. These traditions are the source of stability, identity, continuity, nurturing a sense of belonging, and shared purpose. One of my former teachers once wrote that, and made an impression on me, quote, "Tradition is the living faith of the dead. Traditionalism is the dead faith of the living." Tradition is the living faith of the dead. Traditionalism, the dead faith of the living. It is traditionalism that often gives tradition a bad name. Vindicating tradition, vindicating tradition, is a much-needed conservative challenge of our time. This is a great challenge for us, vindicating tradition. Also a great challenge is the challenge to revive community and community life. This is of interest to a lot of young people in America who feel quite alienated and isolated and have various social, emotional problems as a result. So reviving community is a preoccupation of conservative policymakers and thinkers. Robert Nisbet is especially important in this area because his whole thrust of his scholarship was really the attempt to regain the largely lost sense of community life many experience in our time. He wrote his most famous book. Kirk's most famous book was The Conservative Mind. Nisbet's most famous book, which I commend to you, I think a lot of you would find it interesting, is called The Quest for Community. The quest, the search, the quest for community. He places primary emphasis on community and social institutions. Conservatives are very, very focused on institutional life and rebuilding institutional life in America. And if we can't do it through the traditional mainstream institutions, we're doing it by creating new alternative or parallel institutions that have the values that we think are important. Nisbet placed this primary emphasis on community and social institutions, arguing that they are integral to a reinvigorated conservative politics, recognizing the vital role of intermediary institutions. This phrase is very big with conservatives like Kirk and Nisbet, and still very, very important in conservative thought, because most conservatives, almost all the important intellectual ones, focus their intellectual diagnosis for the problems and solutions and also conservative policies at what they call the intermediate layer of society. There's the individual, to keep it simple, individual, and then the layer of society, the family, the church, the schools, fraternal organizations, civic life, this sort of variety of institutions that protect the individual from the state, because the state is always hammering down on conservative institutions because their loyalties, our loyalties are to our places and to what's closest to us, our families, our schools, our churches. And so the war is, are we centralizing power at the state level for either liberal or conservative ends, or do we focus on the flourishing and the health of the institutions that protect the individual from the state? and that are so important to maintain freedom as we understand it, ordered freedom. So Nisbet is really good at this. He goes through the Middle Ages. This is very simplistic, but if you're interested in this idea, I would say the Quest for Community by Nisbet and then Yuval Levin's recent book, A Time to Build, take these two ideas, one from the classical period of conservatism and one from today, and you show the continuity and how practically it can be done as well. So it's a very, very important idea of invigorating a culture of association. So that's what conservatives talk about, this culture that we associate. We're social beings. We create institutions that protect that and advance that. And so associations and institutions are important. Otherwise, you can lead to very alienated lives or very dependent lives on centralized state, and neither one is good. This phrase, a phrase that was important for both Nisbet and Kirk when they're talking about their idea of freedom or liberty, was the concept of ordered liberty. And maybe some of you know this from reading some of your classic texts, or emphasis, particularly in the Scottish part of the Enlightenment, emphasized this quite a lot, this idea, the connection between order and liberty, that they are two sides of the same coin. I used this yesterday with a group of amazing students at the LS Corel, some who are here today, but this idea of that there's the one coin of liberty, there's the one coin on the one side is order, on the other side is liberty, but they absolutely go together in conservative thought. And this is important policy, it has important policy implications because it underscores the importance of a well-structured society that safeguards individual freedom within a framework of moral responsibility. So you have freedom and order, maintaining a delicate balance between liberty and authority and anarchy. So conservatives are always busy reconciling, balancing, tensions. They don't like abstractions. They don't like, in general, and they work really hard to take freedom and virtue. We need both liberty and virtue. You need order and freedom. So how that works out, reconciling tensions is important. As Edmund Burke wrote, if you don't have this kind of liberty, a liberty connected with order, then that not only exists along with order and virtue, but which cannot exist at all without them. So you won't have real, true freedom if you don't have some sense of a moral order framework. And this is a delicate balance because the extremes of both are bad. Excessive freedom or excessive order can lead to authoritarianism on the one side, anarchy on the other. So you're always trying to keep them together. Today, the modern self has been radicalized and liberated from most of its restraints and deferring meetings, and is deeply skeptical of truth, except its own, of course. So ordered liberty is a fragile achievement. The conservatives understand that. Self-restraint is what defines ordered liberty. Self-restraint is a very important idea for them as well. Only in this way can you be liberated from an unregulated will. So we need to gain mastery over our inner passions to progress toward true freedom. And so this emphasis on the virtues is almost constant in the vocabulary of conservatism forehand in terms of their formation. And because for them, that leads to true political freedom. Subsidiarity, I guess, is a phrase that comes to mind. There's many Catholic thinkers here. It's a very Catholic idea. The American conservative movement, intellectual movement, first couple of decades was heavily influenced by Catholic intellectuals, even though we live in a Protestant country. Many of the voters were Protestants, but the intellectuals were Catholic. Most of them. There are books on this topic of the religious dimension of American conservatism. It's changed a little, but it's still predominantly Catholic at the top levels. So ideas like decentralization, drawing upon traditions from pre-modern sources is rather common in American conservative circles. And this whole question of devolving power and decision-making to the local level, whenever feasible, is one of those areas where they draw upon the subsidiarity. And I still think that's a very important idea today. And there's various debates, which maybe some of you know, between some conservatives today who argue that nationalism and consolidated political authority are the way to go, to fight the woke progressives, we need to fight like the wokes, and we need to use political power like the wokes, and we need to engage the United States administrative state to fight liberals through law, administrative policy, and other things. That's very against the grain of the mainstream tradition of American thinking, but it has some following today, and people are frustrated and concerned about the excesses of the progressive ideology, and so this debate upon decentralization versus centralization is really hot today. It's a big item, and especially amongst young people who are more open to using the state to wield political power against their enemies than are their predecessors. So not all, but I mean it can be intoxicating, right? It's power. So we know power tends to corrupt acting. So that's very big. The politics of prudence is a phrase that we talked about a lot yesterday at the El Escorial. So I won't belabor that too much with that, other than to say that this is a chief virtue that Kirk and others believe that liberals were intemperate, dashing at their objectives without giving much thought to the risk of new abuses that might be worse than the evils that they hope to sweep away. So that infinite prudence, which as we know is practical wisdom, putting experience, drawing on custom, drawing on your own experience, taking it slow is a very conservative approach. And there are books that talk quite a lot about prudence as a central theme to practice today, political practice. We're not probably, if you read many of the American journals or whatever, and so the last 6 to 8 years of American political life may not look very prudent in the way that it's proceeded, or and I think that that is something that has concerned American conservatives that drift away from to drift toward more incivility, and in our own we're used to that in dealing with the other side, so to speak, but we're not used to that in dealing with each other. And so we've got more intemperance, more incivility, and a lack of prudence. And I think that there's already being a swing back, I think, to a more prudential, moderate, temperate view of political activity and political dialogue and engagement. People are getting tired. But the key to prudence for conservatives, why it's so important, is because it requires sometimes bold action and sometimes not. It doesn't. The key to prudence is knowing the difference, having the capacity of judgment that can distinguish between the ordinary moments and genuine crisis, and in either case calibrate action to proper goals. Prudence requires the use of reason, but also humility about its limits. The limits of reason is a big concept with American conservatives. They're very preoccupied, for the most part, not to be too abstract and theoretical, not to be ideological, but to understand there are limits to reason. There are other modes of knowledge, or there's a way that we can approach knowledge of the truth, other than just sort of abstract reason. Study the past, or certainly through the power of the imagination, can bring us to knowledge as well. So they emphasize different modes of knowledge. I'll probably running low on time here. So I will say that one of the things that Kirk, Nisbet, and I think since we're here today, talked quite a lot about is the future of both our countries, about Europe and North America, of the Americas, depends on a renewal of our civilization and our tradition of manners, our civilization. The writings of Nisbet and Kirk and almost all early conservatives and into today as well can help show a way to a revitalized, I think, Anglo-European kind of civilizational connections. These thinkers always highlighted the economic and political ties that bind Europe and America together in a community of interest that was central to them. It was sort of the foundational glue for them. They believed in the common Christian foundations, that we had a great tradition, and we shared many common foundations, religion, culture, literature. There's so many things that we may have even economic and political traditions as well. While not without its flaws, obviously, Western civilization has played a significant role in shaping the modern world. In a postmodern or post-Christian age, it is more challenging, but not impossible for conservatives to champion the goods of Western civilization, and there's a renewed interest in Western studies in Western civilization, centers dedicated to the study of Western civilization, journals, writing and thinking about Western civilization, the sources of the West for America, but for our common culture. So that's still a very big area that's happening now, which is very interesting. We are, after all, men and women of the West still, and as conservatives, we must tend to our civilizational inheritance, even as we maintain an active interest in the variety of other civilizational experiences and the variety and the differences in and amongst our own civilization. Still, it's a common civilization, a common cultural tradition. As your countrymen, I came across this a month before I came here. The philosopher Ortega y Gasset wrote, and it was someone that Russell Kirk admired. He said, quote, "The simple process of preserving our present civilization is supremely complex and demands incalculably subtle powers." The simple process of preserving our present civilization is supremely complex and demands incalculably subtle powers. So this is, Ortega y Gasset was read by many, still is taught and read by many conservatives. And for them, the focus on the central role of religion in particular is an important guide to our efforts to renew the foundations of Western culture. Well, in terms of policy, there are many interests that these are just breeze very quickly some ways that conservatives, how they think about reality, how they think about first principles. And applying them, conservatives especially are interested in questions of education. You mentioned education. Education reform is a big area for conservatives nowadays, with state education, university education being, overtly hostile and very difficult for conservative professors to even get jobs. People like Robert Nisbet and Russell Kirk wrote extensively about the contemporary state. They were fierce critics of progressive education. They warned against the decadence and degradation of modern education that was robbing new generations of an understanding of their past, as well as being responsible for dangerously low levels of literacy, historic literacy, understanding of our civic culture, literacy basically at every level, including basic skills, writing, reading, math competencies, have just been on the steep decline for so long. So conservatives of the last 25, 30 years have done amazing work, really positive, I think, examples, hopefully for others in this area, recognizing that they can, that there were ways to create new structures, new institutions, and many of those are flourishing. There's all a range of new schools at the secondary level, with many based on classical curriculum, very popular. They teach Latin, they teach Greek, Hebrew, and all the classics. I mean, they're very serious, and they're wildly popular. They're just opening up, they're spreading like crazy in the last 20 years, these classical schools. We have charter schools, which have some state connection, but are still largely free and open to positive education reform, curricular reform. Religious-sponsored schools are everywhere and proliferating. Homeschooling is a big movement in America. I know that's not possible in every place, but in America it's very big. Of course, the government would like to shut it down, but they've not. We have such a strong tradition of it. It's not likely. And frankly, 15, 20 years ago, Harvard, Yale, Berkeley, Notre Dame, whatever, they were very biased against admitting homeschooled kids and other kids to their colleges. Today, they're the first ones out there recruiting them. They are really great students. They show up. They're going to be very successful alumni. They're going to be good donors someday. So the changes are just happening, right? Which are extremely positive. And this was the groundwork for a lot of this was laid by the early conservatives like Kirk and Nisbet. And they really focus these schools on the virtues, on character development, moral education, and the comprehensive understanding of history and tradition, which is really, really exciting. So there's hope on the horizon there. Obviously, family and communal support has been a primary area of focus because I mentioned the intermediary institutions, family, the church, schools being the most important, and of those, the most important is the institution of the family. And there's been many challenges legally and otherwise to a traditional understanding of the family, but there's also been a lot of really encouraging developments in recent time that have been pro-marriage, pro-parenting, working towards stable, encouraging stable family structures, providing local support for organizations that are there to help shore up family and children in schools. And there's a lot going on that's positive in the area of family and community support. And I think conservative public policy is very focused on that now as well. The economic space is a little more complicated, but generally speaking, conservatives have been committed to private property, free markets, economic entrepreneurship, and economic opportunity, but they also seek economic approaches that support moral and social frameworks that can direct the energies of a dynamic economy toward a level of social stability and that's necessary for genuine human flourishing. So Russell Kirk had the phrase that he took from a Swiss economist, Wilhelm Röpke, called the humane economy. He talked about the humane economy, having social and moral frameworks for the economy, but allowing it to be free and vibrant at the same time, not choking it off. But one not just focused on getting and spending, but on the promotion of human happiness. And I think that's again a very difficult balance and challenge for policymakers, but it's an important one. Finally, on this front, I'll just mention conservatism in the environment, which is very interesting because Russell Kirk was one of the very earliest, conservative, who advocated for a kind of a conservative environmentalism, which really he didn't call it environmentalism, he called it conservationism, a kind of conservative approach to conservation. And this has kind of taken hold amongst a certain group of young people, especially policymakers. There's a lot of kind of interesting things that are happening in the area of stewardship and conservation as being inherently conservative in terms of the values that they emphasize, and that it's our responsibility to protect and preserve the natural world for future generations. So Russell Kirk is considered to be a leader on that kind of idea of sustainability, stewardship, and conservation. After all, we're conservatives, right? Conservators might be a better word in some ways because conservatism can mean different things nowadays or labeled differently. But we are conservators of a tradition, and we are conservationists too when it approaches our natural world, which is you have such beauty. So I will say that at the end of Kirk's thought, and this will just conclude, that he liked to say, when asked what to define conservatism, he would say that, little paradoxically, he said, conservatism is enjoyment. And conservatism is enjoyment. Enjoyment. It's in recognizing and celebrating the good things in life and the world that we live in. It's about family, it's about faith, it's about friendship, learning, laughter, music, a good bottle of wine, a 5.5-hour walk to the Valley of the Fallen, as we did the other day, a beautiful sunset, a mountain view, watching your countryman Carlitos Alcaraz hit a drop shot, really, I think is beautiful. So I have many of these elements of the good life, which are challenged, that we fundamentally want to conserve for our own enjoyment and for the enjoyment of the future. And I think that is the essential underpinning of any joyful and true conservative proposal. Thank you.